9-0043. The next item, which discusses the same thing, well, the other two newspaper reports are the same exhibit number. Mr. President, I would like to leave that issue there, but I would like to say this before I depart. The paragraph 316, 318, and 321 and 322 from the prosecution, as I've already explained, make mistakes about the role of Mr. Silas Taros, the issue of rigging, and the issue of the dates. But I would like also the court to keep in mind the mistake they make in claiming in that paragraph. They say specifically that in that 316 they say, in addition to the rhetoric against PNU and its supporters closer to the election, Mr. Sang started to foment notion that the government would steal Kalenjin votes designed to ODM and rig elections in favor of the ruling party, the PNU. He urged listeners. Now, this repetition of the party PNU, the ruling party PNU, is on the face of it just mistaken, because PNU was not in government at that time. This Kibaki, Honorable Mwai Kibaki, was a candidate for PNU then. Well, probably nothing much turns on it apart from reflecting just how mistaken the prosecution understand Kenya. They're just so mistaken, they can't even get right what were the parties in issue and who were the candidates in issue. PNU was not a ruling party at that time. It was the party that was seeking to be elected into office. I just wanted to mention that in passing. I would like from this point, therefore, to move on to the other segment of what the prosecution alleged against Mr. Sang. I have already explained that they have made the allegations that Mr. Sang used the words weeds, that Mr. Sang used the words weeds, enemies, thieves, nuisance, and parasites. And we maintain that Mr. Sang never used any of those words, and the prosecution, in reflection of the fact that Mr. Sang didn't say them, were not able to produce any audio that supports that proposition. The second segment of what they say is that Mr. Sang made the allegations that the Kikuyus have taken away the Kalenjin lands and Kalenjin jobs. But just before I go into that, may I also mention that on this issue of the rigging of elections, there is nowhere where it is said that Mr. Sang, from the audio that we have shown, where Mr. Sang says either the vehicles belong to Kikuyus or the administration policemen that are being used are Kikuyus. The proposition that Mr. Sang is fomenting an attitude towards Kikuyus as a tribe is an unnecessary extension of an attempt to incriminate Sang. Because, as we've highlighted in our submissions, it is not necessarily the case that every PNU member was a Kikuyu or that every Kikuyu was a PNU member. And so this argument that Mr. Sang was inflaming Kikuyus and every time there's reference of PNU, it was a reference to Kikuyus is really stretching the point to a point that that is not necessarily reflected by the face of the facts.
Is it the case or not? Or what does the evidence say in this regard as to whether politics in Kenya, at least at that time, the material time, ran largely along ethnic lines?
That we don't dispute, Mr. President. We concede that substantially political parties were predominated by a segment, were predominated by tribes in respect to particular parties. But we are saying there were overlaps. There were Kalenjins who were in PNU, and there were Kikuyus who are not necessarily in PNU, who were in ODM. So that if the intention was to assist ODM, the campaign alleging that PNU is a third party, if the intention is to assist ODM, the articulations on behalf of ODM would alienate some people, because some Kalenjins were in PNU and some Kikuyus were in ODM. That I think is the best way I can put it on that, in that regard. But may I say that we make very candid and measured admission of the question whether or not people belonged to tribes necessarily, that each tribe represented a party, or rather a party represented a tribe. We are saying there were overlaps. That I want to emphasize. Mr. President, at this point I would like to move on to the issue of the allegation that Mr. Sang made the arguments that Kikuyus have taken Kalenjin lands and jobs. We have said, and we maintain the position that Sang never said those things. We, however, make this concession that that was a live issue, and from time to time people would call in and discuss that subject. It is a subject that pre-existed Mr. Sang. It is a subject that was there during Mr. Sang's time in the station, and it is a subject that outlived Mr. Sang's place in CAS FM and as a journalist. At least he has since stepped down because of this case. But the point is that that is a live issue that is obtaining in Kenya. Now, even assuming that Mr. Sang had discussed that issue, we submit that it doesn't constitute a crime, because it is an issue that is legitimately discussable in a democratic situation. Mr. President, having come that far, I intend to cover the issue of the media ban when we resume. But at this time, I would like to discuss the issue I had pointed out, that even if Mr. Sang had used those words that are alleged that he used, they are not criminal in terms within the confines of the law. And for purposes of making that argument, I propose that, with your permission, that I have my colleague, Dr. Buisman, address the court.
Would you also be returning to the matter of whether the allegation that Kikuyus had taken Kalenjin land, or a disproportionate share of the jobs, that he didn't say that, would Ms. Bausman also be returning to that? Or are you leaving it at that? That you're saying that that is legitimate discussion, that's protected speech in context. Would that come back in your submissions? Let me get to the point here. And the matter there is whether that kind of discussion, again, first of all, isn't part of what is to be considered when it is being said that Mr. Sang's general attitude was anti-Kikuyu. So assuming that there's some other evidence with this kind of material reporting or harping upon or repeating the story that Kikuyus are fairly represented in government positions and have taken Kalenjin land, isn't it something that should be considered in general decision or finding on whether or not there is scientific Kikuyu sentiment on his part? That would be one question, and this corollary to that, of course, is it possible that that kind of discussion, even if it is founded in fact, can it not be manipulated by someone who may have an anti-Kikuyu agenda for sinister purposes? For instance, why should the poor Kikuyu in the Rift Valley, man or woman, have to be killed or injured simply because there's a middle-class Kikuyu in Nairobi who has government job? Is it not something that rises? It's a legitimate question.
Mr. President, I agree that if reference to it is used in a way that misrepresents the fact of it, then it can be treated as being inciting and soliciting feelings. However, if it is reported as a statement of fact, as an issue that is live, that is being discussed, we submit that it is protected speech and cannot be a subject of trial. Now, the excess in terms of the insidiousness, in the sense of the malice in it, the injection of the incitement and the solicitation, is an issue that rests on the shoulders of the prosecution in the discharge of their burden of proof. Now, this brings us to the problem we've always had about Mr. Sang's case. When you have a witness coming and saying, Mr. Sang said Kikuyus are taking away Kalenjin land, comes, sits there, says that, and walks out. Mr. President, one of the questions that comes is, what do you want us to do? We do not, Mr. Sang didn't say it. That's the starting point. So what do you want us to do? What do you want us, we can't fabricate the context or the environment under which that such discussion can have been said to enable us to dispute that. All we can say is that that is not true. And that is why we would pray that you place some premium on the need for the prosecution to place more than a word of mouth on these things. When they merely allege, we will contest, we challenge, but we do not, we are sometimes short of what to contest it because it doesn't exist. That is as much as I can go at this moment. But may I request to come back to it after the lunch break? I should be able to have a better answer to that question.
You should, and while you do, think of, you've raised the question of context, and that's always something that we keep coming upon on the law repeatedly, even when you talked about how to interpret Article 7.2a of the Rome Statute and what it says. I mean, the first thing international law tells you is that a treaty is supposed to be interpreted in its context, and in light of its object and purpose. So context, you see, it's always there. So the context of speech, you say a speech should not be taken out of context. You say that, but doesn't that also work on the other side? In the defense saying certain reporting of something is legitimate news, protected speech. Can we take that reportage of information or news or commentary out of the context in which it is made, including other things being said, or including the circumstances of the society in which that kind of material was being uttered in the air? Isn't, again, that part of the context in which things should not be taken out
of? We would like to be understood on the part of Mr. Sang to be saying that everything must be taken into context. It is our submission, it is our very fundamental submission that in fact the context in which Mr. Sang said whatever he said should be taken into context. And that is why we have gone at great lengths to show the context in which the issues of rigging of elections, the context in which what Mr. Sang said, the context of what the context, the environment under which Mr. Sang made the comments that he made at the station in relation to the rigging. It is the same thing on the issues of jobs, it is the same thing on the issue of lands. Now, again, Mr. President and the honors, Mr. Sang did not go into a forum and say, people, do you notice that Kikuyus have taken our jobs and land? That we are saying he didn't say. And one of our difficulties is when a witness fabricates that, and we've said that these are fabrications, what are we supposed to say? How are we supposed to react to that? We also want to place weight on the proposition.
Let me make life easier for you because you're about to leave and then when we resume, your colleague would take over. It looks like you say, "What do you, Judge? What do you want me to say?" This is, but if your position is that, look, these statements were not made, um, why don't you leave it at that? That when you say these statements were not made, but even if they were made, they are protected speech. Of course, questions will have to be asked of you about the second limb of your argument, that even if they were made, they were protected speech. And that's how the questions I ask you arose.
Well, we will take the risk, Mr. President. I think we want to make that argument. We will take the risk because if I were to accuse you of being obese, you get annoyed. You could get annoyed.
Who told you that?
No, I'm not saying. I'm not saying that is. I'm not saying I'm saying that, but I'm saying if somebody were to tell you you're obese, you're likely to get annoyed. You're likely to be confrontational. But that doesn't take away the fact that that is a statement of fact. Now, if it were the situation that in fact it was in public domain, the discussions were being had, that in fact Kikuyus have taken away important government positions, and it was being discussed by everybody, and Sang is one of the everybody. Assuming that was the case, and you're saying Sang didn't say it, but assuming Sang engaged in such a conversation, does the fact that it is Sang who has participated in that discussion distinguish Sang as a criminal as opposed to everybody else in Kenya? There are over 20 million people. Does it mean that that is when the crime is committed because Sang has put his voice into that subject? That is really our point. We will make the argument, Mr. President, even if it entails an element of risk.
Now that it is established on the record for posterity that the presiding judge is obese, we can leave it at that and come back.
All rise.
I'm sorry, my colleague just reminded me. How are you doing on time?
I promise to spare you the 30 minutes that the court has asked for. It is just a possibility we might not. We might finish in the next fast session, Mr. President. Possibly.
We'll leave that there. Thank you.